The county agricultural agent hadn't finished reading the parcel description when Doyle Mabry started laughing. It wasn't a small laugh. Mabry was a big man with a big voice, and he didn't use either one sparingly. He turned to the man sitting beside him in the folding chairs at the back of the Heron County Extension office and said, loud enough that the whole room heard it, "You see who's bidding on the Kessler bottom?" The man beside him looked. Half the room looked. Tess Holloway was sitting in the third row with a cashier's check for $450 folded in the front pocket of her jacket. She was 29 years old, recently divorced, and she had not been back in Heron County long enough for people to have updated whatever they thought they knew about her, which meant they still operated on the old information. She was Dell Holloway's daughter. Dell Holloway, who had sharecropped the Birch Creek farm for 16 years without ever owning a square foot of it. Dell Holloway, who had died in March, owing 11 months of back rent and a small debt to the feed co-op. She kept her eyes forward. Mabry said something else, quieter that time, and there was a short laugh from the man beside him. The room settled back into the particular silence of a public proceeding where something uncomfortable has just been said and no one wants to extend it. She bid her $450. The auctioneer's gavel came down, and the silence that followed was a different kind entirely. If you've ever watched someone do something that looked foolish to every person in the room, and privately wondered if maybe they knew something nobody else had thought to look for, then this story is going to stay with you. Tess had grown up watching her father farm land that belonged to other people. She had watched him work it carefully, respectfully, the way a man works something he loves but cannot keep. Dell Holloway was not a careless man. He understood soil. He understood seasons. What he had not understood was how to own anything, how to accumulate anything, how to build anything that would outlast the next lease renewal. She had spent her 20s trying not to be that. She'd gotten a degree in environmental science from a state school, married a man who worked in commercial real estate in Nashville, and spent 6 years convincing herself that distance from Heron County meant she was building something different. The marriage ended in the way some marriages end, not with a single event, but with a slow accumulation of evidence that two people have been telling each other the wrong story for a long time. She'd come back to Heron County for her father's funeral in March. She had stayed, partly because she had nowhere specific to go back to, and partly because the county's forfeited property list had come out the same week, and one parcel on it had stopped her cold. The Kessler bottomland. 68 acres along the South Fork of Birch Creek, last farmed in the mid-90s, abandoned when the drainage tile failed, and the lower third flooded permanently. The Kessler family had stopped paying taxes on it 4 years after the flooding started. It had been county-held ever since, generating nothing, used by no one, written off by everyone who looked at it as unfarmable. Tess had looked at it differently. She had spent the summer before her senior year of college working for a woman named Arlette Dunn, who ran a small wetland reclamation operation 2 counties east. Arlette was 68 then, sharp and unsentimental, the kind of woman who answered questions with more information than you'd asked for and expected you to keep up. She had shown Tess how Muscovy ducks worked a flooded field, how they moved through standing water-eating duckweed and aquatic sedge down to the root systems, how they improved water clarity, how their rooting behavior at the margins broke up compacted sediment and let native grasses reestablish. People think flooded land is dead land, Arlette had said once, not looking up from what she was doing. But flooding doesn't kill land. It changes what it's doing. Give it the right animals and enough time, and it starts telling you what's underneath. What's underneath? Tess had thought about those words for a long time. She had also spent time with the county plat maps. The original surveys for the Kessler bottom showed 2 spring notations in the northeast corner, both marked with the small symbol the county surveyors had used in the 1880s for a reliable water source. Those springs had fed the bottom before the drainage tile was installed in the 1960s, before the hydrological pattern of that section was deliberately altered. When the tile failed, the water came back in a way the original designers hadn't intended. But springs don't disappear because drainage patterns change. They go underground. They find new paths. And if you restore the right conditions, sometimes they surface again. It was the word sometimes that made reasonable people decide the Kessler bottom wasn't worth thinking about. Tess had $450 in a cashier's check and no other plan. Sometimes had to be enough. The first night she slept at the property, she didn't sleep on the property. She had a tent and a sleeping bag and a headlamp with fresh batteries. And she had stood at the collapsed gate and swept her light across the field and understood immediately that the 68 acres she now owned were approximately 90% standing water, cattails, and a duckweed surface so dense it looked solid until you stared long enough to catch the way it moved in the wind. She set the tent up in the right-of-way. The mosquitoes found her within 15 minutes. In the morning she called Arlette Dunn. Arlette answered on the third ring. She didn't say hello. She said, "Tess Holloway," in a tone that confirmed she'd kept the number. "I bought some land," Tess said. "What kind?" 68 acres of bottomland, South Fork of Birch Creek, Heron County, flooded for about 25 years. Duckweed wall-to-wall, drainage tile that's been gone longer than I've been alive. There was a pause on the other end, not a disapproving pause. More like the pause of someone rearranging what they expected the conversation to be. "What did you pay for it?" $450. Another pause, shorter. "That's either very smart or very wrong, and I can't tell yet which." "Neither can I," Tess said. "That's why I'm calling." Arlette asked about the spring notations on the plat maps. Tess read them to her verbatim. Arlette was quiet for a long moment. "I've got 31 Muscovies right now," she said finally. "I'm 72 years old and my back has been filing formal complaints since April. I've been looking for a reason to reduce the flock." A pause. "You find me a reliable water source and secure paddock fencing on that east margin, I'll lease you the birds for cost of transport and a handshake agreement that you send me pictures when the water comes clear." "That's all." "That's all. I want to see it work. I'm old enough that watching land get written off permanently is harder on me than the trouble of doing something about it." Tess thanked her. Arlette told her not to thank her yet and hung up. There was a man named Jasper Red who lived on Route 12, 2 miles from the Kessler bottom, in a farmhouse that had been in his family since his grandfather built it. He was 77, thick through the shoulders in the way of a man who had done physical labor most of his life, with a face that had been outside in all weather for decades and showed it plainly. He had farmed the county's northeast corner for 40 years, before his own land was sold out from under him by a family dispute he never discussed directly, only in the flat language of someone who has processed an old injury to the point where it no longer has the power to surprise them. Tess found him through the County Historical Society, which held a collection of photographs and survey documents he had donated from the mid-century farms of that section. She knocked on his door on a Tuesday morning in late April. He looked at her from behind the screen door before he opened it, taking inventory the way a man takes inventory who has learned that most visitors come wanting something. "Mr. Red," she said, "my name is Tess Holloway. I bought the Kessler bottom at the tax sale last month. I'm told you knew that property when it was farmland." He studied her for another 5 seconds. "Dell Holloway's girl?" "Yes, sir." Dell passed. In March. He pushed the screen door open. "Come in and sit down." His kitchen had the organized clutter of a man who lived alone but not carelessly. Stacked papers on one end of the table, a coffee cup on the other, and a corkboard on the wall with photographs pinned to it. She recognized the hills in several of them as the northeast corner of the county taken from high ground. He set a cup of coffee in front of her, without asking, and sat down across the table and waited. She told him the plan. All of it. The Muscovies, the spring notations, the timeline she had roughed out, for how long it might take a managed duck flock to clear duckweed at that density. He listened without interrupting, in the particular way of someone who listens with silence rather than expression, the more demanding of the two. When she finished, he turned his mug in his hands once. "You know what's in the northeast corner of that bottom?" he said. "The spring notations, 2 of them. More specifically." He looked at her steadily. "There's an old mill foundation, limestone block laid probably 1870s by the look of the stonework. The Kessler mill ran until around 1920, then sat abandoned and got covered over as the vegetation took it. By the time the drainage tile went in, nobody remembered exactly where the foundation sat. When the flooding came back, it went under. He paused. I walked that bottom when I was young enough to walk the whole county on foot. I know where the mill sat, and I know what's under it. She waited. The main spring head, the one that fed the mill wheel, it's not gone. When ground gets suppressed by standing water long enough, the spring flow goes lateral, finds cracks in the limestone, keeps moving underground. But the source is still there. It doesn't dry up, it hides. He set his mug down. You clear enough of that duckweed, get the sediment moving, put the right animals on it, that spring is going to surface again. I've thought about it for 30 years, and I've never had a reason to say it to anyone who might do something with it. Tess sat with what he'd said and felt something settle into place. Not certainty, something closer to a map becoming readable. Will you help me find it? She said. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her at the door. The same assessment, the same private conclusion. I'll come look at it Saturday, he said. What you do with what I tell you is your own business. It was not a yes. She knew better than to push a man like Jasper Red. She thanked him and drove the 2 miles back to her property and stood at the collapsed gate in the April morning and listened to the red-winged blackbirds working the cattail margins and thought about a limestone spring that had been hiding in the dark for 25 years. The Muscovies arrived on a wet Saturday in early May. Arlette sent them with a man who drove 6 hours and spoke in 4-syllable sentences. He backed the trailer to the east margin, where Tess had run a temporary fence line with posts and wire she'd bought from the co-op on a payment arrangement she'd had to negotiate carefully. And he opened the trailer door, and the birds came out the way ducks come out of any enclosed space, with a combination of purpose and unpredictability that made it impossible to watch anything else. They went to work within an hour, not in the random splashing way of birds exploring new space. They moved along the duckweed margin with a systematic efficiency she hadn't expected, pulling surface growth, working the edges where the cattail stems met open water, diving in the shallower sections. By the end of the first week, a visible channel of clearer water had opened along the eastern margin. By the end of the third week, the channel was 12 feet wide. Tess had moved her tent inside the property by then, onto a strip of dry ground along the north fence line she'd cleared by hand. Jasper Red had appeared the following Saturday as promised and spent 2 hours walking the accessible margin with his walking stick, pointing out features in the landscape that weren't visible unless you knew what to look for. A slight elevation change in the northeast corner where the ground rose above the flood level. A section where the cattails grew in a slightly different pattern, indicating harder substrate beneath. A stretch along the north bank where the water had a faint movement that the rest of the standing water lacked. Springs over there, he said, pointing northeast. Maybe 180 yards, maybe 200. Your birds are going to tell you when they find it. How will I know? They'll change direction, he said. Moving water and standing water feel different to a duck. When they start pushing northeast against their natural grazing pattern, you'll know they've found the pull of it. He was right, it took 6 weeks. She was checking the east fence line on a Thursday morning when she noticed the lead birds, the older Muscovies that set the flock's direction, had broken their usual pattern. They had been working south to north all week. That morning they were pushing northeast into the densest section of duckweed, against the wind, with a purposefulness that looked different from foraging. She watched them for an hour. They kept going. She called Jasper Red that afternoon. He came the next morning with his walking stick and a pair of rubber waders, and the two of them followed the bird's path as far as the cleared water allowed, then tracked the direction on foot through the shallow margin where the sediment had been disturbed enough to walk without sinking. 160 yards in, Jasper stopped and stood very still. Then he crouched and put his hand in the water and held it there. "Feel that," he said. She crouched beside him and put her hand in. For a moment, she felt only the tepid stillness of water that had been sitting in August sun for weeks. Then, below the surface layer, she felt it, a slight, persistent coolness. Not cold, cool in the way water is cool when it's coming from somewhere underground that the season can't reach. Jasper stood up. He didn't say anything. He looked at the water and at the birds working the sedge 20 yards ahead and at the slight movement on the surface she now knew to look for. "It's here," he said. By August, a man from Nashville had been to see her twice. His name was Brennan Tilse. He drove a dark gray SUV with Tennessee plates and wore the kind of clothes that cost a specific amount of money without announcing it. He had a deliberate manner and the face of a man who had trained himself not to react to things in front of other people, and he had done his homework before both visits. The first time, he came with an offer of $72,000 for the property outright. He explained that he had an interest in the county timber acreage on the northeast side. Several hundred acres of landlocked woodland with no road access and no water access. Her spring, if it proved reliable, would change both those conditions. She told him she wasn't selling. He came back 3 weeks later with $110,000 and a prepared-looking smile. She told him again. She wasn't sentimental about it. She had done the arithmetic. The landlocked timber was worth substantially more than what he was offering for the only water access that could make it developable. She had confirmed this through the county extension agent, a careful woman named Rena Bogue, who had told her, in the measured tone of someone who gives information and lets people draw their own conclusions, that spring-fed water rights connected to landlocked acreage put the property holder in a legally strong position, strong enough that an independent assessment would be worthwhile before any negotiation. She didn't have money for an assessment yet. What she had was a flock of 31 Muscovies, a truck she'd bought with careful months of saving, and a spring that was producing 12 gallons per minute of 42-degree water in a county that was currently in its 8th week of the driest summer in recorded memory. The drought had come the way the worst things come, so gradually that people kept calling it a dry spell long after it had become something else. June was dry, July was worse. By the second week of August, the South Fork of Birch Creek, which had flooded 68 acres of her bottomland for 25 years, had dropped to a trickle in the main channel. Wells all over the county were pulling air. Hers wasn't. The cleared spring head in the northeast corner was producing as steadily as it had in May. Jasper Red had told her early on that limestone springs don't respond to summer weather. They respond to decade-level precipitation patterns. She hadn't understood until August exactly why that mattered. The first neighbor came on a Tuesday. Walt Gruder farmed 120 acres of row crops east of the property, and he pulled his truck over on Route 12 on a morning when Tess was checking the fence line and told her, in the flat tone of a man who doesn't find it easy to ask for things, that his well had dropped to 20 feet and was pulling sediment. He had 60 head of beef cattle. She let him run water through a gravity-fed pipe she ran from the spring to the north boundary. The spring had the elevation advantage, and the pipe cost less than $200. She told him to come daily and bring whatever containers he needed. A second neighbor came Thursday, a third on the following Monday. By the end of August, she had 5 operations using her water. Running on a rotation schedule, she managed with a notepad and an alarm on her phone that went off every 4 hours. She was sleeping 5 hours a night, some nights 4. The heat didn't break until after midnight and came back before 5. And the work of managing that many animals across that much varied terrain left her falling into her bunk at night like something poured into a container. She did not complain about this to anyone, because there was no one to complain to, and because she was too tired to maintain the performance of being all right, which is a different state from actually being all right, but takes considerably less energy. Doyle Mabry came on a Friday afternoon. She saw his truck from the cabin doorway and recognized it before she recognized him. He walked to the property line with the careful movement of a man who has prepared himself to ask for something he'd rather not have to ask for. She met him at the fence. "My daughter-in-law's family has a dairy operation on the county road," he said. He wasn't looking at her directly, which was its own kind of information. "Their well gave out 2 weeks ago. They've been trucking water in, but the cost." He stopped. "They've got 40 dairy cows in production." She understood. Dairy cows under water stress didn't just drink less. They dropped production, sometimes permanently. The cascade was fast and punishing. "I heard you've been helping people," Mabry said. "I've been letting people use the spring," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her then, directly. Something moved in his face she hadn't seen in April, when he'd laughed. It was a complicated expression, the kind that has more than one thing in it and is uncomfortable to hold. "I wasn't fair to you," he said. "At the extension office. I knew your father, and I figured—" He stopped, tried again. "I figured the apple didn't fall far. That was an uncharitable thing to assume about a person, and I was wrong to say it the way I said it. It was not a polished apology. It came out the way real apologies come out, when someone has been working up to them a while without rehearsal. Tell your daughter-in-law to call me today," Tess said. "We'll put together a schedule." He nodded once. He put his hand out. She shook it. After he drove away, she stood at the fence line for a while and watched the Muscovies working the cleared channel, the northeast section where the water ran visibly faster than the rest of the bottom. The spring was moving at 14 gallons per minute now. She had measured it twice in the past week. It had not dropped. Brennan Tils's third visit came in late September, 2 weeks after the first serious rain of autumn. He drove in slower than the other times. He got out without the careful neutrality he'd maintained before and looked at the cleared bottom, at the spring head visible now through the opened channel, at the pipe running to the county road that had carried water to 6 operations through 11 weeks of drought. He looked at it all with the appraising eye of a man whose business is understanding what things are worth. 6 operations, he said. "At peak," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I've bought 3 properties in this county in the last 4 months. 2 of them I'm not comfortable with, in retrospect. The owners needed money, and the drought made the need acute, and I used that." He said it without decoration. "I'm going to offer them back at the same price." She waited to see if there was something following it. "What I want," he said, "is a legitimate easement negotiation. The spring access, the mill foundation crossing, assessed at what it actually is, not at what I could get you to accept in a dry year. My attorney will reach out to whoever represents you." "I don't have an attorney yet." "Get one before we talk," he said. "I mean that genuinely. What you have here is worth more than either offer I made you, and any agreement should reflect that." She accepted it as what it was. A man deciding to do the thing that cost him more, because the alternative had become something he wasn't willing to be. Jasper Red came the following Saturday with 2 jars of something he set on her workbench, without explanation. She looked at them. "What are these?" "Cattail pollen," he said. "From your northeast margin. I collected some in June when it was right." He looked at the jars. "Specialty item. Health food market. Baking suppliers. Goes for $40 a pound if the quality's there. You've got margin coverage that most wetland operators would spend years trying to establish." He paused. "I should have mentioned it sooner. I wasn't sure you'd be here long enough for it to matter." She picked up one of the jars and held it to the light. The pollen was fine and yellow, and there was more of it than she'd expected. "You had an opinion of me," she said. "I had incomplete information about you," Jasper said. "That's different." He turned and looked at the cleared channel through the south window. The Muscovies were moving in their late morning pattern, working northeast toward the spring. "My wife used to say you can't know what land is worth until you find out what it can do under pressure. She meant people too, I think. She usually did." Tess set the jar down. "Tell me about her." He looked at her. She thought he might redirect. He had that quality, a slight shift in posture that preceded changing the subject when something got too close. He didn't redirect. "Her name was Carla," he said. "She grew up 1 county south. She could read water the way some people read a room. What it was doing, where it had been, where it wanted to go." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have looked at your bottom in April and told you exactly what was under it. Nobody would have listened." "You would have listened," Tess said. He looked at her with something in his face she hadn't seen from him before. "You would have too," he said. "That's not a guess. That's something I know about you now." The county assessor's revised parcel assessment came in October. She opened the envelope standing at the cabin doorway in the morning cold. The assessed value had been recalculated at $890 per acre, based on documented spring yield, cleared acreage, established cattail harvest records, and historic structure notation. The limestone mill foundation had been formally recorded as a county landmark in the processing paperwork, which carried its own implications for permitting and protection. 68 acres at 890s an acre. She did the arithmetic standing in the doorway. Then she sat down on the porch step because her legs had made that decision without consulting her. She had paid $450 for a flooded field that every person in Heron County had walked past for 25 years without stopping. She had bought it with the last money she had, in a room full of people who'd watched a man laugh at the idea. She had come back every morning and done the next thing and refused to stop until the land showed her what it had been all along, waiting under 25 years of standing water and the accumulated judgment of people who had decided it wasn't worth the trouble of finding out. She thought about her father, not the grief of him, which had become something she carried rather than something she was lost inside, but the specific memory of him standing at the edge of Birch Creek when she was 9 years old, explaining to her a flooded field wasn't a dead field. He'd said it the way he said everything, quietly, with the patience of a man who believed that explaining things carefully was a form of respect. She hadn't understood it then. The easement agreement with Brennan Tills finalized in December at $16,800 annually, indexed to inflation, with a water quality monitoring provision that gave her the right to review any activity on the northeast timber acreage for creek impact. Jasper Redd had found her an attorney in the county seat who handled similar negotiations, and who had told her, during their first phone call, that spring access rights connected to landlocked acreage were the kind of case she found professionally interesting. She signed the papers on a cold December morning and drove home through a flat gray afternoon, and did not feel the need for it to be anything other than what it was. Arlette Dunn drove herself up for a visit in January. She moved with the deliberateness of someone who has decided their knees' formal complaints are noted but not dispositive. She stood at the south margin and looked at what the Muscovies had cleared over 8 months. The channel ran visibly now from the east margin to the northeast corner, 30 feet wide in most sections, with the spring head clear at the northeast end, a steady upwelling of 42-degree water that ran south into the open channel and kept running. Arlette looked at it for a long time. "Your father used to say flooded land was just land that had forgotten what it was," she said. She had never told Tess this before. "He said that. He worked for me one summer, years before you did. He was not a practical man in most ways." She paused. "But he paid attention to water. You get that from him." Tess looked at the spring head moving in the January cold, clear and steady and indifferent to the season, doing what it had been doing underground for 25 years, while the world above it wrote the land off and moved on. She had paid $450 for this. She had come back to it every morning, when the only thing pushing her forward was the absence of anywhere else to go, and a single practical thing she'd learned from an old woman who ran ducks on flooded fields, and told the truth about land in the same flat tone she used for everything else. The land had told her the truth back. Not the easement agreement, and not the reassessment, and not the moment Doyle Mabry stood at her fence and said something that cost him something to say. Those things were real, and she didn't minimize them. But the story underneath all of it was simpler than any of them. She had shown up. She had listened. She had given the land enough time and the right conditions to show her what it was. Everything else had followed from that, the way water follows from high ground to low. Not by force, but by the ordinary operation of what it is.